I'd like to welcome Esther Leslie here. It's a great honor and a privilege to have Esther here. Esther is one of the great authorities on Benjamin, and from my time back at the UK, I heard a number of times. And I would say that actually that in the UK there is a very strong fondness for the work coming out of Benjamin in particular. And recently I came across an article that Esther wrote about Walter Benjamin in the anniversary that was it was produced the 75th anniversary of his death in Port Boo, and I'd be very interested to ask Esther about some of the her reflections on the piece itself, which is also itself already a reflection on Benjamin. So maybe you could say just a few words about what motivated that particular piece and why you see an enduring relevance in the work and ideas of Walter Benjamin.
The piece, which is called Walter Benjamin, Refugee and Migrant, if I recall correctly, was first written in 2015. I was invited to write it as part of a celebration, commiseration around the 75th anniversary of Benjamin's death, suicide as he was fleeing fascism, the Nazis in Europe, and attempting to cross into Spain on his way to the United States. So I was asked to write a piece on Walter Benjamin now, which raises the question that you ask, it in the sense that it very much sets out from the perspective that Benjamin still has a lot to say to us. And at this event at the Whitechapel, there were some contemporary artists' films that reflected on Benjamin and other talks. And I think it's interesting to say in the United Kingdom, there's a fondness for Benjamin and, lots of work goes on, and that's true. But there are also camps and arguments and battles about the meaning. And often when I write about Benjamin, there's a certain element of polemic there. And I think I recognize it in the piece that I wrote, in the sense that Benjamin can be romanticized, and that final journey of his across the Pyrenees, attempting to escape, is an extraordinary journey. And I know there are some efforts to make a Hollywood film about it and all sorts, because there is something very dramatic there. And it's very easy to get caught up in the drama of that movement and see it as a tragedy, as almost an inevitable act that would end in failure, and just reinforces the sense of Benjamin, the bungler, the melancholic, the saturnine, and so on. So I think I wanted to look at that journey not just as a closed story of Benjamin's movement, but to open it up, as the memorial by Danny Caravan at Port Bull does too, into a question of the movements of all sorts of refugees in that period, crossing, both flowing from France to Spain or fleeing fascist Spain into France, and a general turmoil. This isn't just about this heroic individual who's going to fail. There's also a certain kind of polemic against a strand in Benjamin's studies that wants to see him as an extremely abstract philosopher whose work is somehow detached from its context. And one of the things I do in my piece is just to see how much Benjamin was embedded in his context. I found some writings in book reviews where I think he has such a sharp analysis of how Nazism came to be in Germany, and he traces it back to the 19th century. I also think about him as someone who's not just uprooted by the coming to power of Hitler in 1933, who suddenly thinks, oh dear, I better get out of here. He's someone who's developed this criticism and this fascination with capitalism and with urbanization, and that has already uprooted him from his native home of Berlin and sent him to Paris for his extraordinary explorations of the Arcades project. But he's also someone who can't get a university job, partly because he's a Jew, partly because of his political outlook. And there may be other reasons too. Maybe he had an antipathy towards that sort of work in a way. But so he's poor. He's always scrabbling for work, and so he takes on radio shows or writing for journals, or he goes into a sort of self-managed exile in a sense to cheaper parts of Europe where he's able to live in a cave virtually and write and survive and be able to eat. So I wanted to reinforce also the material Benjamin, you know, as someone attempting to live as a writer, as a journalist under capitalist conditions. So all of that is there, and so because of that, I also start to think about his exposure within cities, his fascination with the specific architecture of Berlin or of Paris or city planning. You know, this is someone who spends a lot of time walking to the library where it's a bit warmer, so he can sit in there and do his work, and he passes through very evocatively named parts of the city, and this gets him to think very much about the sort of the city we pass through, the city and the kind of poetry of the city as it resolves itself within our heads, the city of imagination, the city as somewhere that's a collation of colonial impulses that come through in the names of places or in the movements of people into those cities. So, you know, he's understanding this world as alive, a very alive and dynamic space of movements, which is legible in some way, and not just in a arid, you know, this building was built at this time and made of these materials, but really deeply in terms of how this place is named can tell us about the history of colonial exploration, for example, and the movements of people. But what we come to see is also marked by the power relations in the present. So I was trying to shovel all of these different themes about Benjamin's migration and other people's migrations, and then how that shifts historically into becoming a refugee, because for Benjamin at a certain point he couldn't just travel to Ibiza or Capri or Paris or Moscow or the north of Sweden and so on. He couldn't just do that and return. There comes a point when there is no return, just as there is for many people today. And of course this piece was written as well in response to shifting politics of migration that have been occurring over the last period, the reinforcing of borders, the emergence of fortress Europe, and also the developing in across time of more fortress-like border conditions within the USA. And the piece was reposted online in 2019, and I think that was very much in response to new developments around Brexit and the ending of certain kinds of freedom of movement, coupled with an extremely hostile migration politics in the UK. Of course, in Trump's America, all of the discussion about erecting a wall on the border between the United States and Mexico and so on. And so there's an echo within the piece, or a reflection within the piece, on the Mediterranean as a massive grave of lost bodies of refugees who've tried to cross from outside of Europe, from Europe's fringes through that sea to other lands, to solid land. And that's provoked in a sense by kind of coming back to the romanticism of Benjamin. If one is in Port Bull and one looks at the memorial that Danny Caravan made, which is a very impressive piece, it's a metal shaft like passage that ends in a glassy wall, and you cut down through it, and you look at the Mediterranean below, and you might imagine that was the place where Benjamin met his fate. But of course he didn't. He came over the mountains and he took his life in a hotel room in that town. But we're looking at this Mediterranean, so beautifully blue, and all of the foam and the scurf. But particularly in the period when the piece was being reposted, that was a death ground. That bodies were washing up onto beaches in that region of people who, like Benjamin, had been compelled into migration, were refugees, were trying to find a place simply to exist. So for me, that was one of the very poignant echoes, and a reason for returning also to this vocabulary, which is always a contested vocabulary: migrants, economic migrants, political migrants, refugees, asylum seekers. Opening those words up again and trying, at least through the case study of one very celebrated man, think about the human life behind those phrases and what people are compelled to do.
Yeah, I think Benjamin is an astonishing figure. I mean, along with other associates like Georg Simmel, like Siegfried Krakauer, Adorno, and so on. What I find astonishing is the very sharp way in which they were able to understand modernity ahead of their times in many ways. And what I find also fascinating about Benjamin is, even though he was somehow trapped by it, he predicted that the rise of fascism in a very kind of clear way. And it was very prescient. I'm just wondering how, I'm particularly interested in the rise of populism now, and the kind of the rise of not just Trump, but others elsewhere. It seems almost that that's another aspect that is even more kind of pressing right now. And he glimpsed all that in his writing. I'm especially I'm speaking from California, from the States, especially Trump himself, and I'm wondering if there's any kind of particular kind of lessons that became very clear as we saw Trump's popularity over here, that you can kind of trace back to Benjamin's thinking.
I suppose, I mean, one of the things that Benjamin says in his great unfinished work, The Arcades Project, is that the flaneur is the mold into which sort of or from which the fascist is cast, which is quite a striking and hardcore thing to say, because in some ways, we think of the arcades, these passages lined with shops, as places of dreaming and wonder. And Benjamin, is very enthused by the surrealist take on the arcades as these liminal spaces of dream worlds where umbrella handles will come to life and mannequins will lure you in with their erotic appeal and so on. But I think he's also saying that with the birth of the arcades, we have the birth of a consumerism which is reliant on colonial exploitation and world markets, and we might in certain ways transfer that into our understanding of globalization today. And what that does is to to produce a phantasmagoria or fantastical or dream world of capitalism, such that we will be, I suppose, just drawn into those spaces and relate to the promises that they throw at us, the promises of sort of beautiful lives and luxury and intoxication, and in some sense then all of our relationships with each other become mediated through these items that we can possess. And to that extent, I mean, it's something Benjamin writes about in One Way Street when he's writing about the great inflation in Germany in the early 20s, and how everything comes down to not being but having, and relationships between people are mediated through this kind of hardness of things. So maybe there's a sort of thingliness or reification and a huge amount of fantastical projection that comes with consumerism, and the flaneur in a sense is utterly exposed to that. They wander through all of this in their kind of dream world, hoping, you know, that the ideal society will somehow be delivered by this commodity system. And maybe Benjamin's saying, you know, that's the mold for the fascist who perhaps transfers the commodity into the dictator or some other you know, charming charismatic entity that will deliver to you perfection, but take away from you the sense in which all of this is made by us, by human hands, and in relation with each other. So I mean, I think it's a slightly different, but I suppose parallel take to Adorno, thinking about the ways in which the culture industry or the cultural commodities serve up all sorts of promises that keep us on the edge of our seats and make us think that, you know, we will be the chosen one, we will be special, and we're in sort of competition with all the others who might benefit from the good luck that we hope to be ours. Maybe that's part of it. I just think he also had a very strong sense of what he would call petty bourgeois resentment, anti-intellectualism. You know, he came from the youth movement, you know, and until the war broke out, when he broke with the youth movement for its insufficient condemnation of the First World War. But up until that point, you know, he was someone who believed in Geist and culture and, you know, the critical energies of youth, and anti the bourgeois family and anti morality, and, you know, wanted, you know, something more passionate, I suppose. Romantic anti-capitalism was at work, but, you know, that was in response to a conformist, petty bourgeois, resentful culture that you could see dominating in Germany, and which seizes its moment when it backs Hitler. And as you know, as Benjamin will also say, you know, the capitalist class needs to save itself in some way, or to save its profitability, and so they will go with this figure for some time. I think Benjamin has quite a materialist sort of sense of that. So it sort of combines our fantastical projections as to what this new world, be it consumerism or be it fascism, might offer those who are favoured by it, together with quite a materialist sort of sense of how power works and how economy works.
I'm always very struck by that, what you're alluding to, his comment about capitalism as this dreamed-filled sleep that swept over Europe, which, you know, again, incredibly prescient in many ways about how the kind of commodification really took off. But of course, Benjamin, unlike Siegfried Krakow, never made it across to the States to see, I guess, the kind of the place where the commodity was fetishized most of all. How do you think Benjamin would have responded if, like Krakow, he had made it across to the States and encountered what would have been a world of television and increasing advertisements appearing on television? How would he have seen that?
Mm. I think, like his friend who also made it, Brecht, um, I think he would have felt very alienated from it. I mean, I think he struggled with English probably even more than Brecht, so would have found it harder to uh, try to hawk his stuff to Hollywood. But he was pragmatic too, and I think he probably would have tried to involve himself in the culture industry in ways that Adorno couldn't. But both he and Adorno, along with Brecht and others, had done a fair bit of work on Frankfurt radio because Benjamin's best friend, Ernst Schoen, his best childhood friend, was running the cultural section of radio there. And Adorno could do the sort of professor lecture kind of thing. But Benjamin really threw himself into it with his radio plays that he did and his radio talks for children about witchcraft and prohibition and Berlin barracks and all sorts of things. So I think he might have tried to make a go with it outside the academic system. I mean, Adorno gets sort of taken up by the Princeton Research Project, and it's all quite academic in a sense, and I'm not sure those openings would have been available to Benjamin, but I think he would have also, drank wine with Brecht in Los Angeles or wherever and just bemoaned how cultureless it all was and how utterly worshipful of the commodity, the culture around them was. But I guess there were quite a few exiles who could get together and bemoan some of those things, I suppose.
It sounds like you're reading him through Baudrillard to some extent, who saw America as this kind of cultural desert. Yeah, but I think unlike Adorno, who was, I mean, skeptical of jazz and things like that, I think that Benjamin really could have understood that world so much better. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, one thing that I find paradoxical about Benjamin, that he's a figure that's been raked over countlessly. I mean, people have written and written and written about him, even though, of course, he was unknown at his time, and it took Hannah Arendt to really introduce him much to the English speaking world. But he's been really poured over, and yet there seems to be still more to be excavated out of his work. So what do you put down his sort of enduring appeal? Why are we still fascinated by him?
I think partly it is the biographical story or the tragic ending. I think that does draw people in. But I know when I first read him, I was quite young and I found an old New Left Books hardback edition of his writings on Baudelaire, um, a lyric poet in the epoch of high capitalism or whatever it was translated as. And I think then, just as today, I think I would still find there's something that cannot be bottomed out within his writing. I even find it with his very much read work of art in the age of its technological reproduction, that each time I read it, there's something new in it, or partly it's to do with his own notion of Aktualisierung or actualization, or how things hit the contemporary moment. So the world changes and we can reconstellate Benjamin's writing in relation to that. Partly it's just to do with the density of his writing, that it's not, or it's multiple reference points, you know, that it's he writes on Baudelaire, but he's not doing a poetic study, but there's some beautiful analysis of poetry. It's not strictly a kind of intellectual biography, although we get some sense of the biography of Baudelaire, but then it's not just about Baudelaire, it's about the city of Paris and how that features. You know, it's sociological, but it's philosophical, it's literary, and it can't be placed, I suppose. So I think he is prescient or foreshadows a sort of interdisciplinary mode of working that I think is more prevalent, or whose value is recognized much more today. But I just think, I don't know, he's just a fantastic writer, and yet at the same time there's always something a little bit open there, a little bit speculative, a bit anti-systematic, so you can never feel you've definitively got it somehow. You know, unlike with Adorno's anti-systematic and difficult, but in some ways every line that Adorno writes is really saying the same thing. Whereas with Benjamin, it's crystals reflecting crystals and shards, and you know, the thoughts run in different directions. You know, you never know really where it's going to go. So I think that's part of the appeal. I also think because somehow, though he had a short life, I mean, you know, he was dead at 48 or something, there are these distinct epochs of writing. So, you know, the strong sort of language, philosophy in the early days, and, you know, and then there's sort of the reading of Lukács and the meeting with Lapsus, and the sort of move away from interpreting Baroque tragedy into thinking about Berlin, one-way street, and the city, and the kind of inflation period, and then the move away from that into radio work, and then move into Paris. There are sort of distinct epochs that also mean one's always comparing Benjamin with Benjamin, and there's always more to say.
Maybe I could just make one further point, or maybe ask a slight further question. I mean, to my mind, I think you nailed it there. I think the idea of crystals reflecting each other. To my mind, he doesn't foreclose things. I mean, he just seemed to be a collector in many ways, and a collector of ideas. And you know, the fragmentary nature of the Arcades project kind of leaves us with these kind of collections of ideas that we can almost string together, like joining the dots, like a constellation. And I think that notion of the constellation, which leaves it open to some degree of the reader interpreting and making a work for his or her own of his ideas, is what maybe makes him so useful and timeless in some senses.
And I think, I mean, certainly that sort of open nature of the Arcades, and again, you know, it's a microcosm project, isn't it? It's like you can find all of the world in there and orient yourself, not just in the Paris of the 19th century, but in the world that he's relating to in the 1920s and 30s when he's writing it, but then also today. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, I was in the Cairo passage in Paris, which is this extraordinarily quite a strange passage, because it's a whole set of passages that sell shop equipment, mannequins and fixtures and fittings for shops. And so, you know, what still clinging on in central Paris is something that you feel is probably on the brink of disappearance, and you know, something else will happen there. But you know, that still exists, that it's shifted into another mode. You can go back to the Arcades project and find the contemporary within it, find something in how he's relating both the history and the presence of that place to the contemporary valence of it. So, you know, it never stops kind of being a yeah, in a way, a distorted mirror of the present, or something, but or you know, through the looking glass kind of version of the present. But that allows you to find things and to speculate and to try to understand its place and your place in the contemporary world. So I love that it keeps on doing that, which it would probably also keep on doing even if the arcades disappeared and there was just a kind of absence there. It would still reflect something into the present from itself.